Here's a fairly detailed breakdown of what's going on in regard to the Kremlin's recent claim that many people in Ukraine's Odesa and Mykolaiv regions want to link their fate with Russia. I'll cover what was said, possible motivations, what evidence, or lack thereof, there is, how credible the claims seem, what the responses are, and what it might mean in practice. If you want, I can also give a shorter summary after this. What was said on September 30, 2025, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that there are many people in Ukraine's Odesa and Mykolaiv regions who allegedly want to link their fate to Russia, but are afraid to openly say so. Peskov made this statement in response to a hypothetical question: what if a referendum were held in those regions on whether to become part of Russia? He said these people are unlikely to be able to raise their voices in favor of this now. It would be simply life-threatening. The Kremlin did not provide any verifiable evidence or sources to support this claim. Context. What has Russia already done? To understand the significance, it helps to remember what Russia has already done in the war with Ukraine, especially with regard to territory, referendums, and public claims. In 2022, Russia declared 4 Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, to be Russian territory after referendums. These referendums have been widely condemned by Ukraine and Western countries as illegal and coercive. Russia also annexed Crimea in 2014, which is broadly not recognized internationally. There has been frequent Russian rhetoric about protecting Russian-speaking populations, historical claims, and strategic interests in southern Ukraine. Some Russian political figures have suggested that it would be desirable to bring more Ukrainian territory, including parts of the southern coast like Odesa and Mykolaiv, under Russian control. Possible motivations behind the Kremlin's statement. Why make such a statement now? Here are several possible reasons, not mutually exclusive. 1. Propaganda, psychological operations, psyops. Putin and the Kremlin might use statements like this to cultivate the perception of support inside Ukraine, to demoralize Ukrainian resistance, or to encourage fears that many might defect or yield. Claiming local desire for joining Russia, even if unverified, can serve as part of a larger narrative that Russia is not just an aggressor but has a supposed popular mandate. 2. Pre-justification for expansion. By saying, many want this, Russia might be laying groundwork discursively for future claims or actions. If later a referendum or some form of plebiscite is proposed, the Kremlin can point back to statements like this as evidence of desire. It helps establish a justification. 3. Domestic audience. Statements like these also play well domestically in Russia. They can feed patriotic sentiment, support for the war, and the narrative of reunifying lands or protecting ethnic Russians or Russian speakers. 4. Strategic leverage negotiations. By asserting such things, Russia may try to shape diplomatic negotiations, influence what Ukraine or the West consider possible, or even force concessions. If there's an assumption or hope that eventually a peace process might consider territory, then saying, these regions want to join, can be a bargaining chip. 5. Testing the waters. It's possible that Russian authorities are gauging reaction, internationally, locally, in those regions, in the media, to determine how strong or credible their claims might be, or how risky it would be to more openly press for control or annexation. What evidence is there, and what is missing? When one examines the claim, certain things are lacking, and some questions arise. No reliable polls or surveys cited. Peskov gave no public evidence, for example, polling data, to back up his claim that many in Odesa, Mykolaiv region want to join Russia. Without that, these are assertions, not demonstrated facts. Fear and suppression claimed. Peskov claims people are too afraid to speak up because it would be life-threatening. That implies suppression or intimidation, but again no independent evidence is given of how widespread intimidation is in those regions specifically, or concrete examples. Local official reactions differ. For example, the mayor of Mykolaiv, Alexander Sienkevich, strongly rejected the Kremlin statements. He said that back in 2022, Mykolaiv residents already clearly expressed that they want to remain part of Ukraine, defending their territory. Past referendums criticized. The referendums that Russia had used in other parts of Ukraine have been widely considered illegal, not free or fair, under conditions of military occupation, propaganda, and coercion. So, past history suggests that the methodology of such votes is deeply contested. This raises credibility issues for any new claim or potential referendum in these regions. Territorial control. Russia does not fully control Odesa or Mykolaiv. Control, military, administrative, is a precondition to holding credible referendums, though Russia has not treated that consistently. Thus, even if some people do prefer Russia, organizing something in practice would be very difficult under wartime, with ongoing conflict. Credibility assessment. Weighing what's known, here are some thoughts on how credible these claims seem, and what uncertainties remain. The claims are plausible but unproven. It is possible there are indeed individuals or groups in Odesa and Mykolaiv who are sympathetic to Russia, as there are historically Russian-speaking areas in southern Ukraine, some local cultural and economic ties, etc. But many is vague, and without data or independent verification it's impossible to assess how large or influential this pro-Russia sentiment actually is. The fear of speaking out claim is harder to verify. In war zones, suppression, threats, and fear are real factors. But again, no specific cases were cited in this claim in Peskov's statement. Whether the fear is widespread or coercive, and whether people are being prevented from expressing opinions, is not clear. The local Ukrainian leadership's outright rejection suggests a competing narrative. If local officials are confident that the population does not broadly want this, or at least that it's not legitimate, that points to a tension in the claims. The strategic stakes are high. Odesa is a major Black Sea port, economically and militarily important. Mykolaiv also is a key region in southern Ukraine. Any change of control or even the claim of popular desire to change control has big consequences. Thus Russia has strong incentive to make such claims, regardless of how accurate they are. Responses and implications. Here's how things are playing out, or potentially could play out, given these statements. Ukrainian reactions. As mentioned, Mykolaiv's mayor criticized and rejected the Kremlin claim. Local Ukrainian officials are likely to defend that their regions remain Ukrainian, both politically and via information narrative. International perception. The statements are likely to be viewed with suspicion by Ukraine's Western allies, because similar claims have been made before in other regions, e.g. the 4 regions annexed in 2022, with referendums widely considered to be sham. So the international community will look for credible independent evidence, e.g. polling, free speech, human rights observations before treating such claims seriously. Potential escalation. If Russia pushes for a referendum or claims one in Odesa or Mykolaiv, that could escalate conflict both militarily and diplomatically. It might also provoke responses from Ukraine, efforts to strengthen control, propaganda, information campaigns, defense, legal, diplomatic issues. Any referendum or vote without Ukrainian government control, or under military occupation or heavy influence, would almost certainly be considered illegal under international law by Ukraine and most other states. That limits the recognition of any change of status, even if Russia were to claim one. Military and strategic consequences. Controlling Odesa or significantly influencing its political alignments would be huge for Russia, preserving or expanding its grip on the Black Sea coast, disrupting Ukraine's access to the sea, affecting trade, especially exports like grain, and military supply lines. So Kremlin interest here is strategic as much as ideological. What it could mean in practice. If Russia is able to act on these claims, or attempt to, here are some of the plausible scenarios, with varying likelihoods, risks, and requirements. 1. Propaganda push and influence operations. More focused campaign to promote pro-Russia sentiment in local media, among local elites, NGOs, social media. Supporting or encouraging local collaborators or sympathetic voices. This is low risk but can shape narratives over time. 2. Attempt to organize a referendum. If Russia occupies more territory or solidifies control in parts of Mykolaiv, Odesa, it might attempt to hold a referendum, as in annexed regions. But this faces major obstacles: Ukrainian resistance, lack of control, international non-recognition, and logistical issues. 3. Negotiated settlement or territorial claims. In any peace process, Russia might try to use the claim, many in Odesa, Mykolaiv favor joining, to push for de facto control or influence, devolution, or border changes. Even if not full annexation, perhaps seek buffer zones, or administrative concessions. 4. Escalation of military pressure. To bring territory under its control, Russia could intensify military operations in those regions, possibly targeting critical infrastructure, or attempting to create a situation where occupying forces can claim control or influence over civilian governance. 5. Resistance, counter-narratives. On the Ukrainian side, we should expect more information campaigns, local polls, if possible, statements from local leaders, like the Mykolaiv mayor, appeals to the international community to reaffirm Ukraine's territorial integrity, etc. 6. International legal, diplomatic challenges. Ukraine and its allies may continue to emphasize that any change of territorial status achieved through coercion or under military occupation is void under international law. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, etc., could be increased if Russia tries to follow through. Broader implications. Thinking about this more widely, here are some of the regional and geopolitical stakes. Ukraine's Black Sea access. Odesa is one of the few major Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea. If Russia were to gain control or influence over Odesa in a meaningful way, it could greatly restrict Ukraine's ability to export goods by sea, especially agricultural products, which are crucial both for Ukraine's economy and for global food supplies. Strategic geography. Mykolaiv plus Odesa form a corridor along the coast. Control here gives significant leverage over maritime routes, military operations from the sea, logistics, etc. For Russia, controlling the southern coastline helps consolidate a land bridge from Russian-controlled Ukraine to Crimea, already annexed, and possibly beyond. Narrative. About identity and legitimacy. The war is not only about territory but narrative. Who deserves to govern what land, what people's identities are, what histories count. By making claims that many want to join Russia, the Kremlin is asserting a claim to legitimacy, cultural, ethnic affinity, historical grievances, etc. that can shape both domestic legitimacy in Russia and influence perceptions abroad. Precedent for future actions. If Russia succeeds in getting any region to be annexed or claims accepted, that sets a model for other contested areas. It might encourage similar approaches elsewhere. International norms and responses. How the world responds matters. If such claims are accepted or treated as credible without scrutiny, that weakens the norm against forced or manipulated referendums, violation of sovereignty, and territorial annexation under questionable terms. My view, likely reality versus claim. Putting all of this together, here's what seems most plausible to me, not certainty. There are individuals, groups in Odesa and Mykolaiv who are sympathetic to Russia. That's almost certainly true, given the complexity of identities in parts of Ukraine, the presence of Russian speakers, historical ties, etc. But it is very unlikely that a large majority, or even a decisive minority, wants or would accept full annexation now, particularly under Russian terms or under military pressure. The fear to speak out part is believable in a general sense: war zones, repressions, influence of Russian propaganda, etc. But without concrete cases, it's hard to assess how pervasive or coercive that fear is. The claim is much more useful to Russia as rhetoric, and possibly as future justification, than it is as a reflection of a currently stable or clear local desire for changing nationality. What to watch for going forward. To assess whether there is substance behind Peskov's statements, and how serious Russia's intentions are, these are signs to watch for. Independent polls or survey data from Odesa and Mykolaiv, showing people's opinions on affiliation, joining Russia, or preference for governance. Reports from journalists, NGOs, or human rights watchdogs of repression, arrests, suppression of speech in these regions, related to expressions of political preference.
Moves by Russia to
6. イン
establish
ターナ
more
ショナル
control,
リーガル、
military,
ディプロマティックチャ
administrative,
レンジ
in
ズ。
parts of
ウ
those
クライ
regions,
ナ
checkpoints,
&ITS アライズ
control of
メイ
civil
コンティニュー
administration,
トエンフェ
governance
ザイ
or
ズザッ
local
トエニー
services.
チェンジオブテリトリアル
Concrete
ステータス
proposals
ア
or
チー
legal
ブド
steps
す
for
るコアー
referendums
ソ
in
ン
those
オアンダー
regions,
ミリタ
and
リ
who
ーオック
organizes
パチ
them
オ
and
ン
under
ズ
what
ボイドアンダ
conditions.
ーインターナショ
The
ナルロー
response
ド
from
と
Kyiv, Ukraine's
サンクション
government,
ズ
do they
ディ
step
プロ
up
マティッ
efforts
ク
to
プレッシ
shore
ャ
up
ー
local loyalty,
ETC ドッ
provide
トク
information,
ッドビ
counter
インクリーズ
propaganda,
ドイフロシア
strengthen
トリ
civil
エスクフォロー
society
する
presence, etc.
のブロー
Reactions
ダ
of
ーインプ
international
リケーション
actors,
ズ
EU,
シンキングアバウ
US,
トディスモアワイ
UN,
ドリー
particularly
ヒ
whether
アー
such
サムオブ
statements
ザ
are
リージョナ
accepted,
ル&ジョ
challenged,
ポリ
or
ティカル
lead
ス
to
テークス
diplomatic action.
ウクライナズブラックシーアクセス
Potential
オデサイズワン
consequences,
オブザ
risks
フ
if
ューメ
Russia
ジャー ウ
acts on
クレイ
these
ニアン
claims.
ポートオン
If
ザブラ
Russia
ックシ
decides to
ー
try to make
イ
these
フロ
claims
シア
real
ワー
or
トゲイン
partially
コント
real,
ロー
it
ル
could
オアイ
lead
ンフルエ
to
ンスオーバーオデ
further
サインが
destruction
ミー
and
ニングフル
conflict.
ウェイ
Attempting
ット
to
クー
take
ッ
or
ドグレー
control
トリー
territory
レストリ
implies
クトウク
combat,
ライナズア
damage,
ビリティテ
civilian
エクスポー
suffering,
トグッズバイシー
displacement,
エスペシャリー
people
アグリカ
fleeing
ルチュ
from
ラルプ
front
ロダク
lines
ツ
or
イ
areas
ッチ
under
アーク
threat,
ルーシャル
loss
ボー
of
スフォーウク
Ukrainian
ライナズ
economic
エコノミ
lifelines,
ー&フォーグ
especially
ローバル
related
フ
to
ードサ
ports,
プライズ
exports,
ス
trade
トラ
routes
テジッ
through the
クジ
Black
オグラ
Sea.
フィーマイコレイブ
Strengthened
プラスオ
Ukrainian
デサフォーム
nationalism,
アコリドーアロン
resistance,
グザ
if
コースト
communities feel
コント
threatened
ロー
or
ルヒアギ
coerced,
ブス
that
シグ
may
ニフィカン
increase
トレ
resolve
ベ
to
ラゲ
stay
オー
with
バーマ
Kyiv.
リタイムルートミリ
International
タリー
fallout,
オペレーショ
more
ンズフロム
sanctions,
ザシーロジ
condemnations,
スティクス
possibly increased military or financial
フォーロ
support
シ
to
ア
Ukraine
コン
from
トローリ
allies.
ングザサザンコーストライ
Precedent
ンヘルプ
setting,
スコンソ
other
リダテア
regions
ラ
may
ンド
see
ブリッジ
similar
フロム
pressure.
ロシアンコント
International
ロール
norms
ド
of
ウクライナ
sovereignty
トゥ
and
ークリミア
territorial
オ
integrity
ーレ
may
ディ
be
アネックスド
further
ポッシブ
tested.
リービヨンド
Conclusion.
ナレイティブス
The
about
Kremlin's claim that many in
identity and
Odesa and
legitimacy.
Mykolaiv want to
The war
be
is not
linked to
only
Russia is a
about
politically
territory
loaded
but
statement,
narratives.
likely more
Who
part of a
deserves
broader
to
strategy
govern
than a
what
solid
land,
reflection of
what
popular will.
people's identities
While it's
are,
plausible
what
there are some people who
histories
favor such
count.
alignment, there is
By
currently no
making claims
independent,
that many
verifiable
want to
evidence
join
showing
Russia,
widespread
the
desire or
Kremlin is
support, nor that
asserting
any
a claim
referendum
to
could be held
legitimacy,
fairly under current
cultural,
conditions.
ethnic
This
affinity,
is a piece of
historical
strategic rhetoric.
grievances,
It supports Russia's
etc.
territorial
that
ambitions,
can shape
potentially
both
sets up
domestic
diplomatic claims,
legitimacy
and may
in
aim to
Russia
sow
and
uncertainty or fear.
influence
For
perceptions
Ukraine and its
abroad.
international supporters, the
President
important
for
tasks
future
will be
actions.
countering
If
misinformation,
Russia
strengthening
stays in
local
getting
governance,
any
protecting
region
civil
to be
liberties,
annexed or
including freedom
claim
of expression,
accepted,
and making
that
sure any popular
SETS a
sentiment,
model
if it
for
exists,
other
is measured by
contested
credible
areas.
means.
It
If you
might
want, I can
encourage
try to
similar
find survey
approaches
data or local
elsewhere.
research that shows what people in
International
Odesa and
norms and
Mykolaiv actually
responses.
think,
How
rather
the
than what the
world
Kremlin says.
responds matters.
Do you want
If
me to
such
dig
claims
that?
are accepted or treated as credible without scrutiny, that weakens the norm against forced or manipulated referendums, violation of sovereignty, and territorial annexation under questionable terms. No, my view, likely reality vs. claim, putting all of this together, here's what seems most plausible to me, not certainty. There are individuals groups in Odesa and Mykolaiv who are sympathetic to Russia. That's almost certainly true, given the complexity of identities in parts of Ukraine, the presence of Russian speakers, historical ties, etc. But it is very unlikely that a large majority, or even a decisive minority, wants or would accept full annexation now, particularly under Russian terms or under military pressure. The fear to speak out, part is very vague in a general sense. War zone, repressions, influence of Russian propaganda, etc. But without concrete case it's hard to assess how pervasive or coercive that fear is. The claim is much more useful to Russia's rhetoric, and possibly as future justification, than it is as a reflection of a currently stable or clear local desire for changing nationality. No, what to watch for going forward? To assess whether there is substance behind Peskov's statements, and how serious Russia's intentions are, there are signs to watch for. Independent polls or survey data from Odesa and Mykolaiv, showing people's opinions on affiliation, joining Russia, or preference for governance. Report from journalists, NGOs, or human rights watchdogs of repression. Arrests, suppression of speech in these regions, related to expressions of political preference. moves by Russia to establish more control, military, administrative, in parts of those regions checkpoint, control of civil administration, governance or local service. Concrete proposals or legal steps for referendums in those regions, and who organize them and under what conditions. The response from KYIV, Ukraine's government, do they step up efforts to show up local loyalty, provide information, counter propaganda, strengthen civil society presence etc. Reactions of international actors, EU, US, and particularly whether such statements are accepted, challenged, or lead to diplomatic action. No. Potential consequences risks if Russia acts on these claim. If Russia decides to try to make these claim real, or partially real, it could lead to further destruction and conflict attempting to take or control territory increase combat, damage, civilian suffering. Displacement people flee from front line or areas under threat. Loss of Ukrainian economic lifelines, especially related to port, exports, trade route through the Black Sea. Strengthened Ukrainian nationalism resistance if communities feel threatened or coerced, that may increase resolve to stay with KYIV. International fallout more sanctions, condemnations, possibly increased military or financial support for Ukraine from allies. Precedent setting, other regions may see similar pressure. International norms of sovereignty and territorial integrity may be further tested. No. Conclusion. The Kremlin's claim that many in Odesa and Mykolaiv want to be linked to Russia is a politically loaded statement, likely more part of a broader strategy than a solid reflection of popular will. While it's plausible there are some people who favor such alignment, there is currently no independent, verifiable evidence showing widespread desire or support, nor that any referendum could be held fairly under current conditions. This is a piece of strategic rhetoric. It supports Russia's territorial ambitions, potentially sets up diplomatic claim, and may aim to sow uncertainty or fear. For Ukraine and its international supporters, the important tasks will be countering misinformation, strengthening local governance, protecting civil liberties, including freedom of expression, and making sure any popular sentiment, if it exists, is measured by credible means. If you want, I can try to find survey data or local research that shows what people in Odesa and Mykolaiv actually think, rather than what the Kremlin says. Do you want me to dig